We are all children of the 20th century. I don't think anyone here was born below or before end of the 19th century. And 20th century, in many ways, has been the most amazing century in the human history. Our civilization goes back 10,000 years. And if we trace any century from the very beginning, nothing has happened on such a grand scale as happened in the 20th century. We had two world wars. We had extraordinary inventions and discoveries in science and technology and medicine. We had incredibly complex and wonderful politicians and artists and filmmakers and theater people in this century. And most of all, we were born in this century, so it makes it all the more interesting. Now, in the beginning of the century, in 1900s, the human population was about 1.4 billion. By the end of the century, there was a 400% increase. It was close to 7 billion. And it's not just the number. Each one of us is staying on this planet longer. In the beginning of the century, again, the average lifespan around the world was under 40 years. Now, in the Western countries, including Australia, Canada, USA, it is over 80 years. So it is double. So it's not just the number of people who are on this planet that has increased by 400%. It's also the time span we spend on this planet. So that has doubled. And our impact, our ecological footprints, therefore, on the planet have increased dramatically. We consume more, all of us. However poor people may be in any part of the world, we consume more energy, more materials than ever before. So here then, I will share with you some of the significant or important people who have made great contributions to the 20th century. Now, such lists are prepared by magazines and broadcasting stations around the world. BBC does it, perhaps ABC does it, and certainly in Canada, we have CBC does it, and newspapers, New York Times and Time Magazine do these things. And so I would not follow their pattern. I would only share with you what I consider, in my own way, people who have made great impact on me, who have contributed to my intellect, my mind, my soul, my spirit, and I feel that they're important people. Not necessarily important in terms of their great impact in every walk of life, but certainly their contribution to making us slightly better human beings, slightly wiser people. So I'll share with you about 10 people who for whom I have great respect and who have been my mentors. And now, as I said, such tests or such lists are prepared by every magazine. And every year, every century, every decade, new lists are prepared. And you see there are the names and people. Some of them you recognize, some of them may be new to you, and some of them you wish they were there. This is the second time I'm presenting this talk on the cruises, and I know when I'm finished, there are always some people who come to me and say, you didn't include this person. So if I don't include your favorite person in my list, please forgive me. It's my list, and you may have your own list. So let's see. There are some people who have had great impact on the 20th century, but I do not wish to include them in my list, because oftentimes their presence has been very destructive. Some very palpably destructive. I mean, who would ever think of Adolf Hitler in any other terms but a destructive presence in the 20th century? What he did, how many people he killed, and how many people he was responsible for their destruction. In the same manner as Stalin in Russia, and Mao, perhaps in a slightly different manner, in China. And so I would not include their names. That's not what interests me. I want to focus only on those who have contributed in what I consider positive way, in a creative way, in a constructive manner. So the man who I consider my greatest hero, Albert Einstein. Now, as some of you have asked me, perhaps I didn't give enough introduction about myself, I'm a nuclear physicist by training. I did my master's degree from University of Punjab in India in physics, and then I won a scholarship to study at the University of Toronto, and I did another degree in nuclear physics, master's degree from the University of Toronto. And I studied Einstein, and I studied physics, and but what touches me about him is not necessarily his great contribution to science and physics, which are absolutely extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. Any scientist, any physicist would say he's the greatest. He's the greatest scientist there was ever. Of course, we can think of two other great scientists who would be probably in the same category. There's Charles Darwin from England, a 19th century Victorian evolutionist, biologist, and then earlier on, Isaac Newton. So these three men, two of them from England and one from Germany, they're considered the three greatest scientists who ever lived. So for me, however, Einstein is not only a great scientist, but he's a great human being. And what he said, and what he did, and what he pleaded for, and what he argued for, has been truly extraordinary. And I want to share with you some of the things he did do. One of the things people asked about him, who was he? What was he? Which country was he from? Now, he presented his theory of relativity and his famous equation, E equals to mc squared, which is probably the most famous equation in all of physics. He was a young man when he presented it. He was only 26. And he was living at that time in Switzerland. And so he was often asked, who are you exactly? Now, his theory that he formulated, theory of relativity, was tested only in 1919, after about 14 years. 1919, I shared with you the other day, was a very crucial year. As the negotiations and peace treaty was going on in Paris, his theory was being tested in England. And two English scientists proved that his theory was correct. That is what practically you could experimentally observe. What he had predicted theoretically was found to be correct experimentally. Now, before this was tested, he was being interviewed by a journalist in England, and he was asked, Dr. Einstein, who are you? So he said, if my theory is found to be true, the experiment, it was still to be found to be true. He says, if my theory is found to be true, then the Germans would say, he's a German. And the French will say, he's the man of the world. He's a scientist of the world. However, if my theory is not found to be true, then the French would say he's German. And the Germans would say he's a Jew. So that's the answer he gave. And in a way, that answer stays well, because he was exiled. He left Germany. As you know, all of us know, that what happened with the coming of Hitler and Nazism. And he lived in England. He lived in Germany. He was a professor there at Göttingen University. And he left. And he left for USA in 1931. And he was director of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton. And he lived the rest of his life in 1956 at that place. So, however, there are many things that are very important to note about him. He was a very committed pacifist. And he fought for peace. He fought and argued for peace all his life. Even when he moved from, in 1916, after his theory had been formulated, and he was being hailed as the great scientist of the times, he moved from Switzerland to Germany during the war in 1916. And he argued with his fellow colleagues and scientists, why are you contributing all your genius and all your ingenuity in creating poisonous gases, as was being done at that time by Germany during the war? And he felt that this is wrong, that the great creativity of science should be contributing to peace, not for destruction. And many times he was being accused of not being a patriotic German. And there was a lot of arguments that went back and forth. And then in 1920s, after the war was over, he was very much in favor and strong supporter of the creation of Israel. And he contributed a great deal for the creation of Israel. In fact, when Israel became a country in 1948, the very first person who was offered presidency of Israel was Albert Einstein. He was invited to become the first president of Israel. And he said, I have no brain for such things. You find somebody else who knows politics. And so he declined it. So what was quite amazing about him, there is a meeting that Charlie Chaplin had with Einstein, and Einstein gives a tribute to Chaplin. He says, "Mr. Chaplin, you are such a great artist. You don't say a word, and yet the whole world adores you." And Chaplin said, "Dr. Einstein, you are a greater man. No, the world does not understand a word what you say, but they adore you." So you can see the wit and the humor and warmth that this man had all his life. Now, let me go back a bit. There is one man in Berlin who was a great child prodigy in music, and that is Yehudi Menuhin. And he was a violinist, and there is often a reference to him in a concert he presented in 1931 in Berlin. And it was a remarkable concert, and he was a boy of, I think, 9.5 years at that time. And the thunderous applause for him. And it is said, it is noted, that after this is over, a bushy-haired man went and lifted this boy in his arms and said, "Yehudi, now I see our God in heaven here in this place." And that was Albert Einstein. So Albert Einstein often was referred to as a man who was a deeply mystical man, who revered the sense of awe and wonder in a very religious sense of the word. Now, often people ask, was he religious? Did he believe in God or not? And many times people debate between science and religion, often bring his name. But he was not a religious man in the orthodox sense of the word, but a deeply mystical man. And he kept arguing for it all through his life. Now, what is one of the things that mars his life? When he was living in USA, and he was, as I said, the most famous scientist of his time, the war was beginning to show its fangs in Europe. And it was in 1939 that he was approached by other scientists living in USA, many of them from other parts of Europe, who too had come as refugees to USA. They approached Einstein that it is rumored, it is believed, it is rumored that Hitler is about to make the first atom bomb. And if he does it, it'll be disastrous for the world. So we should impress upon the President of the United States, Roosevelt at the time, Frederick Roosevelt, to start making the bomb. So it was Einstein who wrote a letter to the President, giving a little brief history, how some of the scientists in Germany may be beginning to contribute their genius and their talents to making the atom bomb. And if that happened, that would be so disastrous. So that is in 1939, is the beginning of what is called Manhattan Project, the beginning of the making of the first atom bomb. It is the biggest undertaking by any group of people, or any government ever in the history, Manhattan Project. And of course, as we know, in 1945, it was made, it was successfully tested in July, and then 2 weeks later, it was used in Hiroshima, and then 2.5 days later in Nagasaki. And that was, for Einstein, the saddest day of his life, because he felt responsible that here I had written a letter which started this huge monster, and that led to the creation of bomb, and then the whole atomic race, a new arms race that started. And then he spent the rest of his life, the next 10 years of his life, really contributing and fighting for atoms for peace, this movement called Atoms for Peace. And he would often say, people would ask him, what would be like the Third World War? He said, if there is a Third World War, what would it be like? He says, I don't know what weapons would be used in the Third World War, but in the Fourth World War, people will be using arrows and stones again. So he was quite convinced that we are leading this whole new warfare that has started, would destroy the whole human race destroy a whole human civilization. And he pleaded for it passionately. He traveled extensively in many parts of the world. And again, because of his prestige as a great scientist, he would say again and again that that's what needs to be done to use atoms for peace. Now, unfortunately, didn't succeed, as many other people didn't succeed, but nevertheless, it speaks very highly of this man who contributed, who used his prestige as a highly honored scientist for the betterment of humankind. Now, here is a quotation that he used to hang in his office in Princeton. And I remember visiting his office some years ago. He was not there, of course, at that time. He was already passed. But this is part of the museum. That it says, not everything that counts can be counted. And not everything that can be counted counts. He really challenged the whole ethos of science. In one of my earlier lectures, I said science very much dwells on measurement, that everything should be measured. And if it can be measured, it is objective, it is scientific, it is precise, and it makes it very, very much a part of law of science. But he challenged that everything that can be counted does not necessarily count. It doesn't have human value to it. And then he reverses it, that everything that counts cannot be counted. And I often, in my conversation with my fellow scientists, I often wish to reiterate that there are human values, there are other values that cannot always be measured. And therefore, our emphasis on just measurement as the only way of establishing truth is not quite right. Now, one of my presentations to you, I talked about this emphasis on measuring intelligence, how it misfired, and a remarkable book that came out called Mismeasure of Man. So this is Einstein's great contribution to the thought that, yes, he was a scientist, but he also wanted to explore the domain of science and enlarge it. Now, this is one of the most remarkable quotations that comes from Einstein. He says, the most beautiful and profound emotions we can experience is the sensation of the mystical. It is the source of all true science and art. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, he who can no longer wonder and stand in rapt awe, is as good as dead. Now, this is coming from a man who is, as I said, truly steeped in scientific ethos and methodology throughout, but still enlarging its scope. Again, he says, to know that what is impenetrable to us really exists, manifesting itself as the highest wisdom and the most radiant beauty which our dull faculties can comprehend only in their most primitive forms. This knowledge, this feeling is at the center of true religiousness. The cosmic religious experience is the strongest and oldest mainspring of scientific research. We don't hear this coming from Charles Darwin. We don't hear this from Isaac Newton. We don't hear from any of the great scientists, and they were truly remarkable in terms of their contribution to science. But that's what makes Einstein stand out. And as I said to you earlier, I have been in awe of him. I have been very much always been thinking of him, that he's a great sage in science. He's a sage, and his sense of wisdom and his sense of reaching out to outer limits of human imagination and perception and consciousness really make him as a saint, a sage, as a modern-day sage of the 20th century. Now, here then comes my second man, Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. He was on Time magazine cover, and Albert Einstein said something quite wonderful about Gandhi. Some of you may know Gandhi was assassinated. He was killed. And was killed by a fanatic Hindu. And this happened as the partition of India was taking place in 1947. There are many people, a new country was created. Pakistan was created on the basis of religion. Muslims moved to Pakistan, and Hindus stayed in India. Now, even though today there are more Muslims living in India than there are in Pakistan, but that's another story. So at that time, a fanatic Hindu who was very upset that the country was being divided, his name was Nathuram Godse, he assassinated him. And when this happened, Einstein said something. He says, in future generations would refuse to believe that such a man as Gandhi walked on this earth in flesh and bones. That was Einstein's tribute to Gandhi. Gandhi is a remarkable man. I mean, I feel proud that I come from a country where he came from, but his message was really not just for one country or one people. His message was universal. And his message is being discovered more and more by people all over the world. His message was of peace and nonviolence, or change through nonviolence, and not through violence, because his belief, very strong belief, that violence leads to more violence, that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And this idea of revenge, of retribution, that this is beastly, this is not humane, this is not civilized. And often Gandhi talked about it in many ways. He talked not only fight against the British imperialism in India, of course he was fighting for India's independence, but he was also fighting for Indian society to be more just to its own people, because there were millions of people in India, even to this day, who are treated untouchables, who are not to be touched. They are sort of ostracized, left out of the equation of humanity and people. So Gandhi would say, I want to, next time if I'm born, many Indians believe in the idea of reincarnation, says, I want to come as one of these people who have been so ostracized, so I can feel their pain. And so he fought for the equality and justice of his own society. That makes him something quite unique. He's not only accusing the other who will say, you are doing wrong to me. No, we ourselves are doing wrong to our own community. And he fought for it a great deal, right to the very end. And, but he also argued and struggled that such things should be nonviolent and peaceful. And he also spoke a great deal about ecology, what we should do, how should we live, so that we live in a sustainable, decent, caring manner for the earth. He was, many people in ecology considered him one of the great patron saints of ecology, like St. Francis of Assisi. He's a patron saint of ecology. He talks about so much about caring for the earth and for all creatures of the earth and all elements of the earth. He had also had great sense of humor. Let me share with you, in 1931, Gandhi traveled, this is before India's independence, Gandhi traveled to London to attend a roundtable conference. And there were many, it was a conference discussion, earlier discussions about India's independence. So he was there, and many people in England, London, England, adored him. They admired his attitude, his policies, his way of resisting the British imperialism at that time. So he had, a meeting was arranged with the king. And he insisted, Gandhi insisted, that he wants to meet the king in the kind of clothes that he wore. And they were very simple clothes. Many people said it looks like a diaper. But that's the way he wear, because he said, my people in India don't have many clothes, so I wear same clothes as my people do. And he refused to wear a pantsuit or anything else. So he finally had a meeting with the king, and when the meeting was over, journalists asked him, Mr. Gandhi, how did it feel to be meeting the king in these clothes? So he said, the king was wearing enough clothes for both of us. At the same time, in the same meeting, he was asked another question, and this is a poignant answer that he gives. He says, what do you think about Western civilization? Remember, he's visiting England. So he was asked, what do you think about Western civilization? And he said, that would be a very good idea. So he all through his life, he said, we pretend to be civilized. We are not civilized. We're not, and his whole emphasis, what makes somebody civilized, or what should make somebody civilized, is really emphasis on equality, justice, fairness, and so on. Got to move on here. Now, as we know, many times Gandhi, over the decades, has become a symbol of goodness. And then many times then you see contrasting with evil. And evil becomes, Hitler becomes a symbol of evil. Now, I said his impact on other movements in the world continues to be very much there. We see in the United States, Martin Luther King was very much inspired by Gandhi's way of resisting and paid great tributes to Gandhi. Then later on, when South Africa became a free country, Mandela, because Gandhi started his movement not in India, he started in South Africa way back in 1890s. And so Mandela paid great tributes to Gandhi, even though Mandela's earlier ways of conducting himself were quite violent. But his 28 years in jail transformed him. And the whole setting up Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, not through vengeance, not through anger, not through taking revenge against those who were treated badly, the black people who were treated badly, but how to have a rainbow nation in which everybody has a place and there is a sense of forgiveness. And he often would speak that these are ideas that he felt inspired and he took from Gandhi. Now, there is in Canada, there's a very fascinating. In Canada, there is a school that has started a little movement called Gandhi's Glasses. A book came out a few years ago, and the school children learning how to mediate conflict, how to do it peacefully, how not to get into states of vengeance, of bullying, and this is become a very effective way of saying how can we take ideas and from a movement that was political in nature, and how to bring it in the schoolyard, in the school, in terms of resolving conflicts. And so you see a grade 3 student supervising grade 1 student in the backyard, in the schoolyard, and if there is any fight, that is how they resolve. So you see how ideas filter and begin to pay tribute to a man who is truly one of the great men of the 20th century. Just last month, I mentioned to you in one of my other lectures, just last month, Gandhi's statue was installed in the Parliament Square in London. And just next to Winston Churchill, who never liked Gandhi, who used to call him half-naked fakir. But nevertheless, here is a country which had been opposed by Gandhi, not as a country, not as people, but its policies. But here, a country paying tribute to one of the great men of the 20th century. So you see how his message, whether it's in Poland or Czechoslovakia or in East Germany, or later on even in Egypt, in the 3 years ago when the spring was erupting in Egypt, so ideas of Gandhi's ideas. So truly a man whose message has become universal. Let's move on. I want to include Charlie Chaplin as one of the people in this list of my list. Now, Charlie Chaplin was an actor, a director, a filmmaker, but he really, in a way, gave a new representation to people who are on the margins, a tramp, and through pathos, through humor, through tragedy, and again he presented these characters who begin to have a universal language. Many of his earlier films were silent films, but he also made films which were very much directed to special issues. Now, in 1931, as said just a few minutes ago, Gandhi, when he was visiting London, Chaplin met him. Chaplin insisted on meeting him. They finally met, even though Gandhi was reluctant to meet him. They finally met, and Chaplin asked him at that time, Mr. Gandhi, is it true that you are against modern technology? And Gandhi's answer was, no, I'm not against modern technology. However, if technology does harm to people, and if it becomes more important than people, then I'm against it. And so, inspired by that, Chaplin made a film called Modern Times in 1936. And Modern Times is about a worker where the machine is more important and the worker is just squeezed in the machine. You see in this picture here how it is sort of squeezed, he's a worker. And Chaplin made this film and dedicated it to Gandhi. So you see how some of his ideas then became a part of his films, but expressed through, of course, simple films and icons. And then Chaplin made another film, and it was a takeoff on Hitler, called The Great Dictator. Now, Chaplin made, of course, a whole lot of films, but one film that got him into trouble, and this is in the United States. And this remark in the film is that if you kill one, you're a murderer. But if you kill 1 million, you're a hero. And this is this during the war, and this is after the war, and during the war and the rise of McCarthyism in 1950s in USA. So there's as though somebody's questioning patriotism. And so Charlie Chaplin never returned to USA, and he died in Switzerland. So Chaplin has a very interesting presence in the history of arts, if you like, because here is a new medium, just beginning in the beginning of the 20th century. Cinema just been invented in 1896, just been invented. But its use through earlier in films, in silent films, and then what kind of messages are various people, directors, actors are presenting. So Chaplin has a very important message to give. I happened to see most of his films at a film festival in Venice a few years ago. And so it's remarkable, his contribution to art and simplicity. And then in the center of his character is an ordinary man, a marginalized person. Now, in our literature, did not see this until in 19th century. You see it in Charles Dickens. And then earlier, really, the stories were not about ordinary people. They're about people in power, or people, or royalty. I mean, all of Shakespeare's characters, a large number of them are mostly from the royalty. But his ranges touches on many other things as well. So here, then, first time in a new medium that is now becoming pervasive all over the world, and his films travel every part of the world. He is a character which is a marginalized person, and how his humanity is being touched. Then I move on to two other people. I mentioned their names the other day briefly, who really contributed to our exploring the human consciousness. Where does our awareness come from? What lies underground? Below our conscious levels of being. And the name of Sigmund Freud, he was the most important psychologist, psychotherapist of the 20th century. And he was a Jew and working in Vienna. He too went into exile in 1937 as Nazism was rising. He moved to London and he died there a year later. But his questioning about our awareness of what are we aware of, what is subconscious, and then interpretation of dreams. Even though Sigmund Freud has become a bit of a passe now, and not many psychotherapists use his approach, but nevertheless his contribution earlier on, very significant. It made us aware that what goes on under the surface sometimes is far more important than what seems to be going on the surface. And as I have shared with you, that we human beings talk far more to ourselves than we talk to other people. And then say, what is it we are talking about? And who is it we're talking to? And so Sigmund Freud, in a way, was the first person in Western psychology which is beginning to touch on that notion that how we can heal some of the wounds that have perhaps been building since our childhood. And then the other man, was a different way of approaching the same idea of consciousness, a cosmic consciousness, a collective consciousness, was Carl Jung, a Swiss psychotherapist, a psychologist. Both of these men and their writings very significant, and their impact has been not only in psychology or psychotherapy, but also in the arts, in our paintings, in our literature, in poetry, and sculpture. So it's a far-reaching impact that continues even to this day. Both of these psychologists, very important. Now, Carl Jung drew a lot from Eastern psychology, from Buddhist psychology and Hindu psychology, whereas Freud was largely rooted in Western psychology. Both contribution, very significant. Now, I quickly mentioned that there have been many significant politicians in the 20th century. And they have been significant because a lot of changes were occurring. in the 20th century. I had the very first name of Mustafa Ataturk. This is the father of Turkey, New Turkey, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. I mentioned the other day in the 1919 peace treaty, Ottoman Empire of Turkey was collapsed. And now what is the new Turkey to be? And this man is really the father of modern Turkey. And he insisted that Turkey will be a secular country, not a Muslim country. Even to this day, the struggle continues in Turkey. It's the secular country. Many times people forget it, that in all Middle East, this country is sometimes vehemently trying to preserve its secular character. And also at that time, Ataturk insisted that Turkish language will not be written in the old script. He changed the script. It will be written in Roman script. And so his contribution to modernizing Turkey, very significant. And many Turks, of course, adore him, admire him, think one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. Then Jawaharlal Nehru in India. He was the first Prime Minister of India, a man who was very much trained in English education and traditions, a wonderful writer. And he was the man who felt that to modernize India, the word modernization, move away from tradition and orthodoxy and the influence of religious institutions in a destructive manner, or traditions that are not giving equal opportunity to women or to people of different castes and classes. So he fought for them. He was a strong socialist. And many of the policies, and many people say, were not quite right policies, but nevertheless, you cannot deny that he was a man who moved India onto a very modern state. He was the person who contributed a very great deal. And I pay tribute to him because India is the only third world country in all of Asia and Africa or Latin America where there has never been dictatorship. And democracy has persevered all these years since 1947. This is not a small achievement, and I think much credit can go to Nehru. Then the third politician, Charles de Gaulle. We were in this last island where Charles de Gaulle came here. He was fighting for freedom of France since it was occupied by the Nazis. And Charles de Gaulle became later the first president of France. Very important politician, very important statesman. Again, I can't go in great details, but he's considered by many as a man who has shaped France, the new republic after the collapse of the liberation of France. Then you have these two other people, Woodrow Wilson. I will talk about it briefly, but let me just say a few words about Winston Churchill. Many people in UK particularly regard him one of the great men of England, maybe the greatest of 1,000 years. And he certainly saved England in the Second World War. His presence was remarkable. But also, he was an imperialist through and through. He felt that's the destiny of Britain. It's the white man's burden. He was imbued with that idea. And many people think if he had continued to be the Prime Minister, perhaps India and many other countries would not have been granted freedom for next decade or two or three. But nevertheless, his contribution to Britain and its nation, preserving the nation, the morale during the Second World War, very significant. Now, Winston Churchill was also a very witty man. I like him on that score. One of the things he said about fanaticism, I quote, who is a fanatic? He says a fanatic is a person who won't change his mind and won't change the subject. That is the definition of fanatic, a person who just goes on and on and on. And then his famous repartee with one of the ladies in the House of Commons who said to him, Mr. Churchill, if you were my husband, I will poison your cup of coffee. And he says, Lady Astor, if you were my wife, I will gladly drink it. Now, the other person of very great importance was Franklin Roosevelt. Now, I mentioned to you this great painting of the 1919 peace treaty in Paris, in which Woodrow Wilson played a very important role. Woodrow Wilson was the first president of USA to travel to Europe as a president. And his emphasis on self-determinism, creation of League of Nations, and new ways of creating a new world. And he really was the person at that time, a new sense of hope that we can live differently. And that some of the wars and treaties that have gone on and entangled with each other, that's not the way to solve things. And he certainly fought a great deal against French Prime Minister in the treaty, because Prime Minister France was very much full of vengeance. He wanted revenge against Germany. And he took the revenge, and we could see how 20 years later it misfired. It came back when France was occupied. So Wilson's contribution to 20th century peace and attempts at peace, not necessarily successful, but very important. Now, then comes Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt probably is the man who ruled, who was president longer than any other president in the U.S. history. He was president for 13 years. It's only after he died that the presidency can no longer be more than 8 years, 2 terms. So Roosevelt came in the he was president during the war, Second World War, and he was president when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. He was also became president when Depression had just started. So he introduced ideas that many felt were socialist ideas, were communist ideas. Remember, there was already a revolution in Russia in 1917. So many people were fearful what should be the new role of state in the lives of people. So he introduced the idea of what's called New Deal, the idea of pension for old age pensions, idea of people who are unemployed, and child support system. So he introduced many ideas which we now take for granted. Every society, certainly in the Western world, and increasingly in other parts of the world, is becoming a welfare state. The role of the state in the lives of people has changed dramatically. And it started in some ways with some of the Marxist ideas, but its real implication or adaptation in a Western country, still having a free enterprise system, but in a Western country, was in the United States. Many people still resent it, but it has now become part of life. And there's no country, no people anywhere who do not look to the state for some help, especially if things are not going right. So the role of FDR in American politics and redefining, reformulating what should be the role of the country, state in the lives of people is very, very crucial. Then his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who survived him, and her contribution, very important, truly important, because she is behind the idea of creation of universal human rights in 1948. Universal human rights, we sometimes become blasé and cynical, but it really is the most remarkable thing in the 20th century, in all of human history, that suddenly we are talking about human rights, the rights of the gay and the black or the disabled, the rights of people everywhere to worship or not to worship this God or that God or no God, these kind of rights. So the idea of freedom being defined. Now we are nowhere near having all those rights being implemented all over the world, but the idea started in 1948, and it's catching on more and more everywhere. And I think the real credit for this goes to Eleanor Roosevelt, a great woman, a great, remarkable woman. The other person that I bring is Mother Teresa. I had the fortune of meeting her many years ago on Easter in Calcutta. And a woman who was not Indian. She was not Indian. She came from Romania. But a woman who took on the concept of serving the others, and especially those who were marginalized, who were poor, who were neglected, and so on. And there were many, and there still are many in the world. And her dedication to it, truly, truly remarkable. And then creating a whole order of other people who would think of service as a way of life, whether it's a religious life or whatever inspires us, but she is very much a symbol of that in the 20th century. I've got to move on. One of the people, perhaps some of you don't know, his name, Ingmar Bergman, is a great filmmaker from Sweden. I admire him greatly because he's a man who took away this notion that all films are essentially for entertainment. And he made a film an art form. he dealt in many of his films, he dealt one topic after another, which truly explored and deepened our understanding of the human condition in great, profound manner. And it's truly, I feel that his come from a small country and a language, Swedish, very few people speak it, but the one film after another he made, it swept the art world of the world. He made films that it is possible to make films in a serious manner, in a manner that explores the human condition in all its dimensions, as we have done in literature, as we have done in theater, as we have done in poetry, but it's rarely done in cinema. So I feel that he's the father of art and cinema, and pay great tribute to his one film after another: Seventh Seal, Wild Strawberries, Through Glass Darkly, Virgin Spring, Silence, Persona, Winterlight, one after another. And really, so many people inspired by that. We are not out there to be amused all the time. You know, sometimes I get tired of just being amused. I want to be exalted. I want to be lifted. I want to see my soul soaring, just as great music does or great poetry does. Why shouldn't the cinema do it? So really, in a way, I feel a great tribute should be paid to Ingmar Bergman for it. Then the other person who I admire greatly in painting, in art, is Marc Chagall. Marc Chagall's paintings are, no other artist has achieved, in my estimate, such a sense of color and sense of exploration, both the inner world and the outer world, a sense of memory and grace. He came from Russia and settled in France, but his images kept coming, being inspired by Jewish mythology and symbols and biblical symbols. And again, done with amazing grace, amazing candor, and lightheartedness, and one image after another. I visited most of his museums in France and other places. Really, in my estimate, truly a great artist, far greater than Picasso and Jean Moreau, and so really amazing work. I'll show you just quick paintings, running out of time here. I want to finish this on this picture, photograph. Some of you may recall. This happened in China in 1990. The democracy movement was building. This young man walks in front of these tanks in Tiananmen Square. And a young, frail young man, just look at the might of the tanks and the might of the state and being faced with this. But there was an extraordinary courage. We don't know where this young man is today. People have been trying to track him down. We don't know whether he's still alive, he's dead, what does he do, where is he? But the thought of facing the whole might of a state and all might of technology and the weaponry, truly remarkable, truly remarkable. It's exalting. But I feel often it's not just the state. Many times this kind of tank as a symbol, this kind of power as a symbol, can come even from your own colleagues, the orthodoxy of your religion, from nationalism, from your own science. Sometimes seems to me we be full of tanks in which we are not allowed to think differently. And so coming to think differently, to be differently, to have the courage to be different, that requires courage. And anyone who speaks of that courage, in this picture, or anyone who suggests us that courage, that is truly a truly great contribution to humankind. Thank you.